Okay, so Danzanravjaa is, or at least was, my portal into Mongolian studies. And what I was doing before was Tibetan studies. This finally brings them together a little bit. So my idea, as you can see from the rather cute subtitle, is I would like at some stage to do a critical edition of Danzanravjaa's poetry, not only in Mongolian, but also the Tibetan versions, and the parallel text too. So, let's see, I suspect almost everyone knows who Danzanravjaa is. But anyway, yeah, there he is. On the left, a picture that is purported to be of Danzanravjaa but isn't. In the middle, a tanka of Danzanravjaa, and on the right, the Danzanravjaa statue at Saint-Jean. So what we know, so everything here is going to be very sort of, foreshortened because we have 20 minutes. But what we know basically about Danzanravjaa's Tibetan and Mongolian poems. He wrote poems both in Mongolian. He wrote poems both in Mongolian and in Tibetan, and he wrote some that appear to be written and translated from Mongolian. And some people have suggested that we can know, and some people have suggested that we just can't know in which order the Mongolian or the Tibetan was written. I mean, we can assume that his Tibetan was good enough simply to write poems in Tibetan. But as you know, in the very first, the only book of Danzanravjaa's Tibetan poems by Altengettel, published in 1968, he says it's really unclear as to which came first. So we assume that maybe there were translations done either by him or by maybe his students or by his scribes. And some poems are recorded as having been dictated by Danzanravjaa to scribes such as Simani Gurbash, Sanjay, and Buchich, Magigosh, so you can tell my Sanskrit is nice. But I think this is not completely correct Sanskrit. I think we can probably reconstruct this as Japanese. Manjugoshe Ditala. Pojang. And finally, which I think is the most interesting for this talk, but also maybe most interesting moving forward, I have not really seen any work in Mongolian or in any other language. There hasn't been a great deal of work in any other language, in which the idea of the outer, inner, and secret teachings, which are central to Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhism, are actually applied to Danzanravjaa's poems. And I think that is primarily because for 70 years, or at least for 30 or 40 years, Danzanravjaa was non grata, and there wasn't really anything done about the meaning behind his texts, or the meaning of his texts. So this is the Tibetan version of this poem that I'm going to look at and very quickly summarize some of the ideas for. It's called, in the original Ranmachuni, otherwise translated in English as A Little Song. Let me just go back very quickly. At the bottom you see, so Altingen wrote, compiled the only Tibetan version of Danzanravjaa's poems in 1968, and then Sarang and Yondu in 1992, note the date, 1992, after 1990, after the Democratic Revolution, published Yadnolik Samur, which has been, I think, republished twice more. And that was a transliteration into Cyrillic. So, the Cyrillic version here is from Sarang Yondu. The Tibetan is ostensibly from Altingen, but the text, whether it's his fault or the printing press, I think has made a lot of very small scribal errors, and I've tried to reconstruct it in a way that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't really change the meaning, it's the spelling, which if you know Tibetan, you'll realize it's not always easy. So Yangnam Chung, so the small, little song, and in Thailand and Yangnam, they call it Bas Vachikanwan. So another song. There is another poem called A Little Song. So there seems to be, that in itself suggests questions about ordering of which one you wrote first, which one was found first, or which one was translated first. Anyway, so for the next four slides, we have the top left, we have my transliteration of the Tibetan. We have the Uchin Tibetan script. In the bottom, we have Sarang and Yonden's Cyrillic, and we have my translation. My translation is probably a really bad translation because it tries to work out what is being said between both the Tibetan and the Mongolian. And we see in the first line, so I'm going to try and think about the outer, inner, and secret meanings as we go through. So in the first line, we have before the rain cloud fades away. So in Mongolian, Usanur is the collected, the gathered clouds. And in Tibetan, Trinka, all of these words are in the right way. Trinka is white clouds. Right? So if you think about white clouds, they don't often give rain, right? So what is being talked about? I mean, obviously in Mongolian, we have kurbor, we have real rain, and we have gathered clouds. Okay? So obviously the idea is about rain. But in the Tibetan, what Danzanravjaa really writes is Tinka and then Chachinda. And Chachinda is a religious term meaning a rain of blessings. Right? So these are white clouds, so not rain clouds, and from that comes a rain of blessings. So this is obviously a metaphysical, this is obviously a religious text. But the Mongolian in 1992 does not suggest that. We can speculate why. And then the fourth line, Donchen Drupna. So this idea of Donchen is replicated in Mongolian as Herik. So the great idea. So if you practice the great meaning, if you attain the great meaning, this is good. Okay? So there is a connection, I'm sure you can see, between a rain of blessings in a religious sense and actually getting the great meaning, which is obviously the meaning of enlightenment. So if you have these blessings from the gurus, from the bodhisattvas and the Buddha, you are able to practice better and thereby attain the great meaning. what I should have said, pointed out at the beginning, you'll see this all the way through, have a very, very repetitive structure in Tibetan, and a slightly less repetitive structure, although fairly repetitive in the Mongolian. But this Nunne Zango in each couplet. So before something happens, then what happens then is good. Right? And in the Mongolian we have similar and sen and sen. So there's a kind of parallelism, but I think in Tibetan, as you see, if you notice as we move forward, the Mongolian model slips a little because of grammatical and syntactical issues, but the Tibetan remains very constant. So already we see that the Tibetan text is probably more so about religious practice. But of course, on the surface, we can also see a more mundane meaning of rain. And I mean, maybe Dunchen is very, very a clear Buddhist image. But as we move forward, we'll see that what you actually see on the surface, you can actually read that as it seems without going deeper into meaning. Second paragraph, second verse. So we have Nyangpa, the gallows, the geese. Geese are really important in Buddhism. As we know, they're really important in Mongolia too. But in Buddhist imagery, the Buddha said, and he didn't say because this is in English, but one translation has to say, mindful people exalt themselves. They are not attached to any home. Like geese that fly from their lakes, they leave one abode after another behind. So there's always this changing, acknowledgement of constant change. And the geese go, they come back, they go, they come back. So these geese, before the winter, it's good for the geese to seek warmth. So they're having some comfort in order to have their stability. Then the second couplet, the Chupa, the religious practitioner in Tibetan is very much a religious practitioner. Of course, non-Tibetan can be a religious practitioner, but also a scholarly practitioner. And I'm thinking maybe that even in 1992, there is this idea that it's more politic, possibly, almost more wiser, to talk about the more mundane reading of these works and talk about scholars rather than religious practitioners. And so the Chupa in the Tibetan text, these religious practitioners, I wonder if that should be named up. I wonder if that should be if they find stability, it's good. That could be possible. But the finding stability, so stable ground, this is good. What is stable ground? It's the context in which you can practice with a feeling of security and with a feeling of steadiness. So it's a metaphysical, as well as possibly in terms of physical stability, it's a metaphysical reading. So we have the geese representing the stable, the enlightened mind, always accepting change and movement. And then you have the religious practitioner who needs to find a place of stability. third verse. So, before you separate from your lover, a heartfelt good talk is good. I think this is when you leave for somewhere else, where not separation and divorce. And so we have here in the Mongolian, satamana, meaning to have a basic discussion, a discussion of basic things. But in Mongolian we have panic, to know what's going to happen, to know the thoughts of the future, or to know distant thoughts. Not really fully understanding what that means. Maybe some of you could suggest something. And then in the fourth line, nyaman. So nyaman is a very clear meaning. Nyaman drupa means to practice meditation, to practice stable mind. But in Mongolian, Akhanok is kind of like observation, which is, again, is not so very dissimilar. But it's interesting the difference, right? In the Mongolian, it's much more technical jargon. It's like a meditation manual, so it's more scholarly in a way. Whereas in the Tibetan, it's very clear that this is about practice. How are we doing for time?
9 minutes.
9 minutes.
Follow-up, but without Q&A.
Okay.
You want to take some Q&A?
Okay. Okay, so this is the fourth verse. What I find interesting in this verse is there's only this one little half line, Chirchilinpa. So this means literally something like to, I'm going to translate it, to grasp the essence of the Dharma. In the Mongolian, we had Edwin Shin. And Edwin, again, is much wider religious understanding. Right? So again, we have a kind of, I don't know, it's possibly something like, we want to remain fairly neutral about this. So we're going to translate it as Ed. But the Tibetan is very clear that this is Chur. And what's also interesting here is that there's this term in the red Tibetan, the second or third, Chudlen. This is I'm sure this is an echo of a very esoteric yogic practice, Chudlen, which is what, it sounds rather fantastic, but the idea was when you're in your mountain fastness, meditating on Dharma training 5 hours a day, that to keep alive, rather like Nurapa et nettles, you would take the essence, the mineral essence from stones, right, and thereby keep alive. But it's also, chud is like shin, and so it's the essence of the Dharma, the real, the core meaning of the Dharma. So to grasp that core meaning, that's good. So in all 4 of these verses, we have the before you do this, this will be good. Before you do this, this will be good. And in every one of these verses, I think there's probably some kind of mundane meaning which you could kind of suggest. But there is also a very clear for me at least, very clear religious or possibly, or certainly spiritual meaning. And I have some ideas also about the secret meaning. So I think the mundane meaning here is the outer meaning. These meanings that I've outlined, I think, are the inner meaning. But there is also a deeper, broader secret meaning, which is possibly not that secret, but it's really about how everything can be used as a method of gaining enlightenment, right, which is very core teaching of Buddhism, but a teaching which is described maybe in some situations as secret, because it's a distant point for many of us. Right? So those are some ideas that I think are pertinent, not only in this text, but I think in the other Tibetan texts that I've looked at. A similar analysis could definitely be suggested for that. So, for future research, we have maybe some questions. Some of these would be answered or at least explored in this putative critical edition that I may or may not be around thinking about doing. So does Danzanravjaa appear to take a different approach in his Tibetan poems from that in his Mongolian poems? I would be really interested. I don't know the extent to which Danzanravjaa found extant versions of the Mongolian texts, presumably in Wickhamsmith. I don't know whether they did translations. Taran uses the word translation in her introduction, but I'm not sure. That would be an interesting mini research point in itself. So, but if they're both his versions in Tibetan and Mongolian, then is he talking in a different way to people who know Tibetan than he is to his Mongolian audience? Which, as we know, he talked a lot to regular herding folk, regular herding people. So maybe he wasn't actually dealing with the secret meanings or even these hidden meanings very broadly when he was talking to his Mongolian students or Mongolian visitors. How can we classify the Tibetan poems? This is a big subject. Are they simply songs, or yang, or du, or songs of experience? Are they gur, or in Tibetan gur, or gurdo in Mongolian? That is, are they just songs, or are they more like Miller's songs? Are they songs about religious experience, spiritual experience? One of the particular tropes and images with which Danzanravjaa describes the spiritual journey. This is something that is very interesting to me. I've written somewhere about him using horse imagery, riding imagery, to talk about the journey towards enlightenment. But I think there's a lot more to talk about. And then finally, what do we learn of his teaching style and his personal understanding of the spiritual path from his poetry? And are these different in Tibetan? That goes back, I guess, to the very first question here. But what do we learn about Danzanravjaa himself? Yeah, I mean, we know some things, and we have some suggestions in books, and I translated those again. But this is a 21st century novel about Danzanravjaa. Raminder used texts much closer to that time, which we're talking about Danzanravjaa. So what can we gather? What can we learn about Danzanravjaa from these texts and from poems that he wrote? So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.